Who is piloting the UAPs or UFOs constantly seen in our skies? Where are they from? Why are they here? How long have they been here? What is their mission on planet Earth? Do they come in peace, or do they have more sinister motives? Join Mad Mark as he uncovers the answers to these questions and many more of the mysteries that puzzle us all on Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. And now, here's Mad Mark. Today's episode, The Creation of Man Part 2, Genetic Tinkering, and Sex. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. I'm Mad Mark, and before I begin, just a quick reminder to please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. I would also like to mention that I have created a new Facebook page specifically for this show. I put a link in the show description, so please go ahead and follow me over there. I'm hoping that this will become a place where we can all gather to discuss each episode and where you can voice your comments and questions. So please go ahead and check that out. Today we resume our studies of Zecharia Sitchin's first book, The 12th Planet, published by Stein and Day in 1976. We now continue with Chapter 12. When we left off on Episode 5, we were discussing the creation of man. But how exactly did Enki and Ninhursag accomplish this task? Originally, many attempts were made and failed. Then, finally, through much trial and error, the correct mixture of Anunnaki and Homo erectus DNA was finally achieved. But one thing that was needed throughout this process, whether the attempt failed or not, were birth mothers. Female Anunnaki were enlisted to carry these fetuses to term. And one of these was Enki's wife, Ninki. Indeed, references to Adapa, the first human, as the son of Enki, implied that this god loved his creation so much that he adopted him. But in those same texts, we also read where Anu refers to Adapa as the offspring of Enki. Thus, it appears that the involvement of Ninki as the birth mother of the Adamu created a genealogical relationship between the new man and his god. This new creation, which is often referred to in Mesopotamian texts as model man or mold, then sent the rest of the Anunnaki clamoring for humans of their own, as we discussed on Episode 5. But, once again, we get conflicting accounts of all this in the Bible. According to the first chapter of Genesis, Elohim created the man in his image. Male and female created he them. Then, in chapter 5, we read that on the day that Elohim created Adam, in his likeness of Elohim did he make him. Male and female created he them, and he blessed them and called them Adam on the very day of their creation. On the very day of their creation, does that sound odd to anyone? I could have sworn that the biblical tale of the creation of man spoke of how Adam was created first, and he was alone for a while. Ah, yes, it's the second chapter of Genesis that we read that Adam was created first, was alone for a while, became lonely, and then was put to sleep, at which time God fashioned woman from one of his ribs. I guess that whoever was responsible for proofreading the Bible must have missed that one. This contradiction, of course, disappears once we realize that this biblical account was a condensation of the original Sumerian source material. Once the perfect Adapa had finally been created, he was used as the genetic mold for the creation of the duplicates. And those duplicates were both male and female. The biblical rib was a play on words of the Sumerian T, meaning both rib and life, confirming that Eve and all of the other duplicates were made from Adam's life essence. and the Mesopotamian texts provide us with an eyewitness account of these first duplicates. In an effort to make a long story short, 14 birth goddesses were present. Ninhursag took the seed, or mixture as it is referred to, and surgically placed it in the wombs of the other birth goddesses, after which there was nothing to do but wait. However, according to the texts, a problem arose when the 9th month came and went, and none of the goddesses had yet given birth. Thus, in the 10th month, Ninhursag, understanding what needed to be done, performed the midwifery and surgically removed the babies. And thus ends chapter 12. We move on now to chapter 13. What was it like for the first humans created on planet Earth? We will probably never know the truth about the earliest days of our species because man was still too primitive and probably way too busy doing all of the work of the gods to have ever written anything down, assuming that he even had the ability as of yet to do so. No, all of the recollections of the early days of mankind were all written and handed down by the Anunnaki. The only complete account of those days, as tainted as it is, regarding the period of time following man's transportation to the abode of the gods in Mesopotamia, is the biblical story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And if you believe that story, I've got a bridge for sale that you just might be interested in. We already discussed on an earlier episode how man was created to do the work of the gods, and likewise, Adam was created to tend God's garden. There was no friendship, there was no fun. Men were created as slaves. But the only time we see the word work in the biblical narration is in the following verses, and they bury it in a way that still makes it seem as if the Garden of Eden was paradise for the humans. We read that, "And the deity Yahweh planted an orchard in Eden in the east, and he placed there the Adam whom he had created. And the deity Yahweh caused to grow from the ground every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for eating. And the tree of life was in the orchard, and the tree of knowing good and evil. And the deity Yahweh took the Adam and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And the deity Yahweh commanded the Adam, saying, Of every tree of the orchard eat you shall, but of the tree of knowing good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For on the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." But this beautiful scenario was soon shattered by tragedy, in what theologians and biblical scholars constantly refer to as the fall of man. "It is a sordid tale of unheeded divine commandments, divine lies, a wily but truth-telling serpent, punishment, and exile." Everything a great Disney movie should be. So, to make a long story short, we've all heard this tale before. The serpent shows up and tempts Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, yada yada yada. She does, so does Adam, yada yada yada, and they both get kicked out of the garden. This is, of course, completely ridiculous. It's full of so many holes I don't even know where to start. So prohibited under the threat of death from even touching the fruit from this tree of knowledge, the two humans are persuaded to eat it anyway. And all that happened was that they were suddenly aware that they were nude? Okay, first off, I need to mention that this is not what really happened at all. There is a lot more to this story that the biblical writers just simply did not want us to know. And we will cover all of that in just a moment. Bear with me. But for now, let's stick to the outline of the book as Mr. Sitchin wrote it. So upon further review, it would appear that this knowing that was being held back from mankind was not some great earth-shattering knowledge, but instead had something to do with sex. For no sooner had they acquired this knowing than they knew that they were naked, and they began to cover up their sex organs. The Bible confirms this connection, because it took no time at all for the deity of this story to put the two together. And they heard the sound of the deity Yahweh walking in the orchard in the day's breeze. And the Adam and his mate hid from the deity Yahweh amongst the orchard trees. And the deity Yahweh called out to the Adam and said, "Where art thou?" And Adam answered, "Thy sound I heard in the orchard, and I was afraid, for I am naked, and I hid." And Yahweh said, "Who told thee that thou art naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree, whereof I commanded thee not to eat?" So Adam admits the truth, yada, 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 blames Eve, yada, yada, yada. She blames the serpent, yada, yada, yada. You know the story. Now, no one can seriously assume that the entire purpose of this story, which led to the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, was to explain how man came to wear clothes. I mentioned in a previous show that Neanderthals and Homo erectus, man's predecessors, had been wearing animal skins as clothing for thousands of years before this. No, the biblical narration of this tale is not about clothing. It's about a man acquiring some knowledge that the deity, again Enlil, did not want them to have. While there is no Mesopotamian equivalent of this ridiculous story, it remains obvious that this tale is rooted in Sumerian origins. We have the location of the story, the abode of the gods, which was, of course, Mesopotamia, and we have the two vital trees, the tree of knowing and the tree of life, which is also referenced in the god Anu's heavenly abode. Even the words of this deity Yahweh reflects the Sumerian origins because he once again lapses into the plural as he addresses some divine colleagues when he says, "Behold, the Adam has become as one of us to know good and evil." Again, there's that whole multiple personality disorder deal again that we're just supposed to ignore. And Yahweh continues on, "And now, might he not put forth his hand and partake also of the tree of life and eat and live forever?" And then the deity Yahweh expels Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Now, there are many Sumerian depictions of early man, the primitive worker that they created, serving the Anunnaki gods totally naked. It didn't matter whether they were serving food or working in the mines. The implications are obvious. Man was looked upon by the Anunnaki as not much more than domesticated pets. And I want you all to remember that fact, because it will come up again and again and again as we continue down this path to discover the truth. I could also have shown you some pictorial examples of these Sumerian depictions of these naked human slaves going about their daily work, but I don't want to get flagged for inappropriate content. So again, check out the examples that Mr. Sitchin includes in his book. Okay, so what exactly was this knowledge that Adam and Eve acquired in this biblical tale that upset this deity so much? Whatever it was, it had to be something that was beneficial to mankind, but that this deity Yahweh, or again Enlil, did not want them to have. Let's see if we can figure this out. To do so, let's begin by examining the curse that Yahweh placed on Eve. "And to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy suffering by thy pregnancy. In suffering shalt thou bear children, yet to thy mate shall be thy desire. And the Adam named his wife Eve, for she was the mother of all who lived." Thus we have our answer. What really happened in the Garden of Eden? Still not making the connection? Okay. As long as Adam and Eve lacked knowing, they resided in the Garden of Eden with no children. And once they obtained the knowing, Eve gained the ability and the pain to become pregnant and have children. Once they acquired this knowing, we read in the Bible that Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. Throughout the Old Testament, the term "to know" is used to describe sexual intercourse. Personally, I think they should have just used the term horizontal bop, but I guess the biblical writers were not nearly as colorful as Bob Seger. So, the tale of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is simply the story of mankind gaining the ability to procreate. And, as we learned earlier, the first humans that were created by the Anunnaki were incapable of reproduction. After all, the first humans were hybrids, mixtures of Homo erectus and Anunnaki DNA. And, like a mule, which is a hybrid of a mare and a donkey, such mammal hybrids are sterile. Through artificial insemination, of course, we can produce as many mules as we desire, even without the actual intercourse between a donkey and a mare. But no mule can procreate and bring forth another mule. At first, the Anunnaki were simply cranking out human mules to suit their needs. Once Enki had created the perfect Adapa Adam, an Anunnaki assembly line was created, utilizing birth goddesses to crank out more copies. Making copies. As it turns out, the inability of hybrids to procreate stems from a lack of reproductive cells within their bodies. Mammals are able to reproduce because their cells contain 2 sets of each of their hereditary chromosomes. But this unique feature is not found in hybrids. So that is what the god, whose symbol, by the way, is that of the serpent, was able to accomplish for mankind. The biblical serpent couldn't have been a real snake because he was able to converse with Eve. But whoever he was, he not only knew the truth about knowing, but he had the knowledge of human chemistry to bring about the necessary changes. This biblical tale drops many hints as to its Sumerian origins. The atom has become as one of us. Could those be the words of Enlil? And is the serpent none other than the creator of humans, Enlil's half-brother Enki? Yes. Enki gave us sex. Let's face it, the antagonism between Enki and Enlil is evident throughout Anunnaki history. The battle over succession that started at Enlil's birth, Enlil comes down to Earth and takes over command after Enki had begun the entire settlement and set everything in motion. Enki had to start the mining operations in Africa, while Enlil stayed in the comfortable command center in Nippur. These two were on opposing sides throughout all of it, and believe me, there is a lot more to come. Enki is mankind's protagonist, while Enlil is humanity's strict discipliner, if not its outright antagonist. And we've barely started. Trust me when I tell you that you haven't seen nothing yet. Even in the Sumerian texts, we read that the god who granted the knowledge to the Adapa was in fact Enki. But why did Enki grant humanity this knowledge? And why was Enlil so against it? These are questions that we will delve into more on future shows. But if you'll notice, from that point on in the Old Testament, man is no longer referred to as the Adam, and instead becomes the singular Adam, a specific person. This is because what Enki did to allow the humans to procreate was obviously done in a lab, not in the Garden of Eden to 2 specific individuals because they ate a piece of fruit, which is ridiculous. All humans were, from that point on, able to reproduce, and I will also cover that point further in the future. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that suddenly the Old Testament concentrates on Adam, one individual, instead of the Adam, which was a term that represented all of humanity. And it becomes so concerned with this one individual that it spends considerable time tracing the bloodline of this patriarch of humanity. And it was after this event that man was no longer just a menial slave of these gods. He was now a person, fending for himself in the world. So, was the punishment of this deity of the Old Testament, or Enlil, for man acquiring the ability to procreate? But why? Well, according to the Old Testament, this deity says, "Lest the earthling also acquire the ability to escape mortality, he shall be cast out of the Garden of Eden." That sentence says a lot if you know what to look for, and what was actually going on in this story, as we've already covered. Enki went behind Enlil's back and gave humanity the ability to procreate, and now Enlil is worried that his brother's next move might be to mess with human DNA some more and also grant them the longer lifespan of the Anunnaki. Enlil was not willing to take that chance. So he kicked everyone out of the facility known as the Eden, or the biblical Garden of Eden, and forcibly shut it down. Does it all make a little more sense now? You're welcome. So, what happened to man at this point? Where did he go? Well, once again, the Bible conforms to scientific findings. It tells us that, "And he drove out the Adam and made him reside east of the Garden of Eden," and research indicates that human culture began in the mountainous regions that border the Mesopotamian plain. So, having been cast out of the abode of the gods, doomed to a mortal's life, but now able to reproduce, man began his new existence. You all know that story. Eve bore 2 sons, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel. Cain is then cursed by the deity and told to move even further east. Now, at this point, we are about to approach another one of those areas of the Bible that have confused me and probably other people for years, because the text tells us that Cain is sent away and eventually settles in the land of Nod, where he takes a wife and has a son named Enoch. Now, even when I was a young child, whenever I heard this story, the first question that popped into my mind was, where did these other people come from? If, as the Bible states in the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which we now know is not at all what really happened there, but let's just play along with the Bible's account for a moment. Adam and Eve were the first 2 humans ever created. They produced 2 sons, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel and is exiled to live even further east, where he eventually settles in the land of Nod. Where did these other people come from, right? This never made sense to me. If Adam and Eve were the first 2 humans and they had 2 sons, one of which is now dead, how can there be people living even further east? Who made them? Why are we just now hearing about these other people? Well, as I explained earlier in this episode, the biblical story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is a metaphor. It's fiction. It never really happened that way. There were many humans in the Eden. It was a human production and research facility. And when Enki went behind Enlil's back and gave the humans the ability to procreate, he gave that ability to every human created there from that point on. Obviously, this did not happen over a couple of days as the biblical story would have us believe. There is no way of knowing exactly how many humans were kept at the Eden facility, but my guess is that there were probably hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. And when Enlil discovers what Enki has done, he closes the facility and everyone is sent away. The Bible simply chose to focus on the 2, Adam and Eve, for the purpose of its fictional story. But many humans were cast out when the Eden was shut down, not just Adam and Eve. So that explains where the people living in this land of Nod came from. But there is one other huge event in human history that got its roots from this story, and once again, the Bible glosses over it as if it were nothing. In the Bible, we read that Cain is worried about being cast out into a new land. He is afraid that he will be murdered by these new people. The Bible doesn't tell us why. But it does go on to say that the Lord put a mark on Cain so that anyone who found him would not kill him. And that is the subject that I want to cover at this point. What was this mark? Did this deity put a hand stamp on him like what we see in local bars and nightclubs? Not likely. Did he whip out his trusty tattoo gun and make some sort of design on his arm? Nope. Remember, at the end of the last episode when I mentioned that there was a reason why all humans on Earth look different depending on their cultural background? Well, it's time to talk about that a little bit. It will also come up again on future episodes. But since we are talking about the Adam and Eve story and likewise what happened to Cain, now is the time to expose this truth. I stated earlier that the entire Adam and Eve story was fictional. What actually happened in the Eden was nothing like the biblical story. Well, this part of the story is fiction as well. This mark that the deity put on Cain was actually done to his parents, not to him. And it was done at the Eden, probably at about the same time that Enki was giving the humans the ability to procreate, because it involves DNA and genetics, and who better to do that sort of thing than Enki? This story is just another example of the Bible glossing over something that was extremely important in the history of humanity. I mentioned earlier in this show, and also on past episodes, that the Anunnaki looked upon these new human creatures not only as slaves, but also almost as pets. Not quite cattle, but close. I also mentioned earlier that once Enki had created the perfect formula for humans, he began cranking them out using that same formula over and over with the help of these Anunnaki birth goddesses. So all of the humans looked pretty much the same at that point because they were all created using the same formula as the Adamu. Let me expand on that cattle analogy for just a moment, since it works the best in this situation. What does a cattle rancher do to distinguish his herd from the other herds in his area? The answer, of course, is that he has them branded. That way, if one of his herds should become misplaced, all of the other local ranchers will know when they see its brand which rancher it belongs to. Unfortunately, the Anunnaki did the same thing to us. We've all been genetically branded. Each Anunnaki god wanted his or her humans to look slightly different than the other gods' humans did. Sometimes the differences were minimal, and sometimes they were quite drastic. Skin color, hairy body, hairless body, nose size, short or tall. If all humans originally looked basically the same, and they did because they all originally came from that same mold that I spoke about earlier, then how could you tell your humans from those owned by your Anunnaki neighbor? What if your neighbor stole one of yours? How would you ever know? His humans look the same as yours do. No, something had to be done to distinguish one Anunnaki's humans from the other Anunnaki's humans. And through genetics, these changes would be passed on from generation to generation. So, as long as Enki was already changing the human recipe in order to give us the ability to procreate, it would not have taken much more effort to tweak each Anunnaki's humans to just look a little different from each other. Now, this is another aspect of human development that would have taken years to implement. And, once again, the Bible glosses over it as if it happened in a day. But Cain looked different from the people in the land of Nod, and this deity knew that they would recognize this difference and leave him alone. That Cain would be safe in the land of Nod because he had this deity's brand on him. And that's what we're basically talking about here, plain and simple. End of story. Now, I may run a little overtime on this episode, but there's one last point that I need to make. This may not have been done to us with the expressed purpose of dividing us, but look what has happened because of it. Racism still exists on this planet, and now that we know the true history of our species, that all humans originally looked exactly the same before the Anunnaki decided to brand us, racism now becomes even more ridiculous. They have used many methods through the years to keep us divided. Through things like religions and politics, they continue their attempts to divide us to this day. What was it that Enlil said at the Tower of Babel incident? Nothing that they plan to do will be impossible for them. He was afraid of what humanity could accomplish should we come together as one. In that case, they divided our speech. But many other methods have been used through the years to keep us at each other's throats. Now more than ever, as more and more of these truths are exposed, we need to come together as one race, the human race. Stop falling for their attempts to divide us. We need to come together as one people and stand against our true oppressors. Stop trying to find ways to divide yourselves from the rest of humanity, and instead seek out ways of bringing us all together, for together there is nothing that we cannot accomplish. And that is where I will leave you for this episode. You have quite a lot to digest there, and we have so much more to cover and learn. I'm Mad Mark, and I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If so, please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. And also, tell your friends and help spread the word about this show. Also, if you have any questions regarding the content discussed on this program, just message me through madmarktv.com or on any of my social media platforms. I also wish to remind everyone that listening to this podcast is no excuse to not read the book that we are discussing here, The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin. It is an amazing work, and I am leaving out much information in order to keep the podcast flowing properly, so do yourselves a favor, please, and read that book. Today we have taken another step in our ongoing journey to find the truth. I promise you that things will get more and more and more interesting the further we delve into this topic of who are the aliens, the history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. Bye for now. You've been listening to Who Are the Aliens? The History of the Anunnaki on planet Earth with your host, Mad Mark. Join us again on our next program when Mad Mark will once again uncover the answers to the mysteries that puzzle mankind.